This episode is brought to you by Roundtable Group, the experts on experts. We've been connecting attorneys with experts for over 30 years. Find out more at roundtablegroup.com.
Welcome to Engaging Experts. I'm your host, Noah Ballmer, and today I'm excited to welcome Dr. Don Kaiser to the show. Dr. Kaiser is managing principal and business finance consultant at Hanover Limited, where he specializes in business development, capital planning, financial analysis, and more. Additionally, he teaches business and finance at the University of Minnesota and at St. Mary's. Dr. Kaiser has over 20 years in expert witnessing and holds an MBA and DBA. Dr. Kaiser, thank you so much for joining me here today on Engaging Experts.
Thank you, Noah. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. Let's jump into it. So you have over 35 years in finance, but how did you first get involved in expert witnessing?
It was kind of by accident. My first case was a case that I've been hired on as an investment banker, and I ended up resigning from the transaction because the client was doing a lot of really dumb things and wouldn't listen to my advice. So I said, okay, gentlemen, I need to leave this engagement. Good luck. They hired a different investment banker, who I will not name here. And that investment banker did the transaction, and within less than a year, it collapsed. And so in the litigation that followed up, the attorneys during discovery found all these memos I'd written to the client. And because this is back before email, so you actually wrote real paper and ink memos. And they called me up and said, would I be happy to testify on what the investment bank that replaced me had done wrong? And I said, oh, I'd love to. Are you kidding? It's a chance to stick my thumb in somebody else's eye. And so I did that. I really enjoyed it a lot. And I realized that I was good at doing it. And so then I had a few more referrals from from friends who were attorneys, and it mushroomed from there. So I've now done 53 cases to date, all across the country, and one international. I did a case last year in Cayman Islands, in Grand Cayman.
Oh, how was that? How was it different working internationally?
Well, it's a British legal system, not an American one. So I asked my attorneys, all of whom were British, said, what are the protocols here? They didn't want to feel like a total idiot. And they said, first of all, never call the judge Your Honor. It's always my lord or your lordship.
Oh, wow.
Said, well, so the first time I actually spoke in the courtroom to the judge, it was a bench trial. And I turned around and spoke to the judge, and I started to say, Your Honor. Then I caught myself halfway through, and I said, no, excuse me, my lord. And he started laughing because he knew I'm an American, and he just thought it was funny. So, but that trial went on for about 5 days. We won that case, and the $20 million award to our side, and that was very gratifying. But it was a different system, quite a bit different system. But otherwise, I've been all over the country on these cases. I found that most cases settle out of court, of course. These are civil cases, not criminal, obviously. Mm-hmm. And most of them settle out of court. Although I've had I've had 7 jury trials. I've got 2 more coming up early next year, and then 1 bench trial.
Having worked across the states and, in fact, internationally, what are some of the differences across different venues? And more importantly, or equally importantly, how do you prepare differently? When you're working in a new venue, do you have to become familiar with some of the laws, or do you have to become, are some of the systems different? What's the preparation like going into a completely new venue that you've never worked in before?
Well, I'm not an attorney myself. I'm an investment banker, so I'm always very careful to not give an illegal opinion.
Right.
I'm very careful not to do that. I have local attorneys, of course, who've hired me, and they are the ones who will give the legal opinions and argue the legal side of the case. I'm there to argue about the investment banking side of the case.
Right.
Standards of care and practice, investment banking practices, financial analysis. So the legal issues aren't too much. What I've learned to be very careful about is that different jurisdictions, though, have different rules about discovery of expert communication. So if you are my attorney and I've been hired by you to represent a case, the very first question I want to ask you at our first conference call is, what are the rules on discovery? And if I can communicate with you without fear of discovery, then I can send you draft reports. I can send you emails discussing my views. In some jurisdictions, those communications are discoverable. And then I have to be very careful about what I write down. And I will never send you a draft. I'll discuss the draft with you on a screen like this, like a shared screen in a Zoom call. but I'll
Sure.
never give you anything on paper. So that's the first question I ask. And that does vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. That's really the only concern I have about local law. Otherwise, I don't really cite the law or give an opinion on the law.
Do depositions go any differently in different venues?
Not really. They're pretty much the same. I've been getting used now to see more video depositions. They never used to be video, and they're now more and more commonly video. And then lately, the last couple of years, because of COVID, I've done Zoom depositions. And my last deposition, the attorney I worked for was in Salt Lake City. The opposing counsel was in Baltimore. I'm sorry, it was in Philadelphia. The court reporter was in Baltimore, and of course here in Minneapolis. So it was an interesting experience, but it works just fine. And we got in the habit of that during COVID. I think we'll probably stick with that now because it saves a lot of costs. Instead of having to fly people back and forth around the country, just sit down at your desk and open your camera up.
Now, as somebody who's been doing this for a long time, how does that change, or does it change the way that you interact? Do you have to change your demeanor? Do you have to make sure that you're, glancing up at the camera to make sure that you're making eye contact? What are some of the considerations when you're doing video or Zoom depositions?
Yeah, that's a good point. I try to, in fact, I'm trying it right now. I got to position my camera so that I'm looking at you and the camera. I'm not looking off somewhere like this,
Sure.
So I have to be a little careful about that. And I wear a nice shirt, and I usually wear a tie. Actually, it sounds kind of silly, but I wear a tie. But I'm at my desk like I am right now in my very crowded study. And so it's usually not a problem. It's usually fairly informal, and it works fine.
Let's talk a little bit more about the other questions that you ask. You're talking a little bit about what you like to ask prospective counsel. You like to make sure that you know the discovery rules, for instance. What are the other important questions when you are being vetted and when you yourself are vetting the action to decide whether or not you're the right expert?
I see that part of my role in the early stages of a case, particularly if I'm brought into the case early, is to help review the theory of the case with the attorney. I mean, I'm an expert on finance and banking. Most attorneys are not. I mean, they're very knowledgeable, and if they've been doing this for a while, they have a pretty good sense of how investment banking works and investment management and brokerage practices. But I am the expert. So the one thing I try to do early on is to help the counsel articulate the theory of the case. What's this case really all about? What are the underlying issues here? Not necessarily just legal, like citing case law, which I don't do, but what are the underlying theories in terms of the practice of banking? And so that's where I think I play a role. One thing I make sure that the attorney understands, and not all of them do, is that I'm not here to be an advocate for your client. That's your job. The attorney is the advocate and will argue the client's case vociferously and enthusiastically. Technically, I am not. I mean, there's an inherent tension in the role of an expert witness. In theory, I work for the court under Section 702 of the rules. I am an objective assessor of facts to help the court in their role as a trier of facts.
Right.
Now, even though I am paid by one side, not the other, and so that's an inherent tension within the role, that I'm paid by one side and I don't want to argue against them, but I'm not there to advocate for them. And so I want to make sure the attorney understands that I can't really fib, not that an attorney would ever fib, God forbid, but I cannot varnish the truth. I have to really tell the court what I think is real. The dilemma is that I've been involved in cases, and usually when I get hired on a case, I know almost nothing about it. I'm given a name check to make sure I have no conflicts. But beyond that, I know almost nothing about the case. Then I get hired. Then I start reading volumes and volumes of text and complaints, counter complaints, motions, email strings, what have you. And then I begin to get a sense of the case. And I've had cases where once I dive into the details of the case, I realize that my client has a terrible case. It's just not a good case. And I'm happy to help as much as I possibly can. But that's usually when I pull the attorney aside and said, look, your case sucks. You need to settle this. I'm trying to be real blunt and do them a favor, because if they want to go to trial, it kind of makes me nervous. So I've had situations where I tell my attorney, my client, that I want to do a mock deposition with them. And I'm going to list out the 5 terrible questions that opposing counsel could ask me that would be damaging to their side, to our side. But I have to answer them truthfully. I can't varnish them. So I do this mock deposition where I ask myself the question and then I give the answer. And by the time I'm finished, my attorney is kind of pale in the face and says, "Uh-oh, I've got a bad problem here." But that's my duty to them, to help them and figure out a way to make the case as palatable as possible without trying to be an advocate for them. And that's a delicate balance. I think a lot of experts blur that distinction and are out there in the courtroom being enthusiastic advocates and champions, and that's not really appropriate. And if the judge is smart, they'll slap you down and say,
Right.
"No, sir, you can't do that. You can't say that."
Right. Both under the rubric of 702 and then other similar, obviously each venue has its own version thereof,
Correct.
but your duty, the expert's duty, is to the unvarnished, unbleached truth, is to neutrality, not to the end client, as you say. Now, you had mentioned, attorneys don't always know that. So have you ever been, not to put you in the hot seat, you don't need to name any names, but have you been in the position where an attorney or the trial team maybe has nudged you a little bit more than you're comfortable with to either frame your opinion in a certain way or to outright change what your opinion is? Has anything like that happened to you? Because that can be instructive to other expert witnesses.
I would say in many cases it has. If the evidentiary rules allow it, I will always give a draft of my report to my attorney, because after all, it's their work product and they're paying me for it, and I want to make sure it fits within their narrative and does not go against the grain of their narrative. So I always give a draft of my report to the attorney or the trial team. However, in a couple of cases, they pushed back pretty vigorously and said, "No, you shouldn't say this, you should say that." And I usually say, "Well, I'm sorry, but I have to give you my opinion as I see it, and I will phrase it as well as I can without damaging your case. But I'm not going to shift my opinion and say something differently because it doesn't marry up with your with the approach you're taking." And there've been a couple of cases we've had some tension on that issue. But again, I remind them that I'm there to be a neutral observer of facts, not an advocate. And we usually work our way past it. These are professionals. I mean, these are not amateurs fresh out of law school. These are pretty seasoned litigation attorneys, and they understand that. So they'll push me a little bit. I'll push back a little bit. At the end of the day, we have a good report that they can live with. And then, as I remind them, my deposition will be pegged upon my report. So when I give my deposition, the opposing counsel will have my report right in front of them. And they'll say, "Now, Dr. Kaiser, on page 7, you say X, Y, Z," and that's fine. And I will support what I said on page 7.
So let's talk a little bit about depositions. So obviously you have your expert witness report in front of you and they're going to quiz you about page 7. But what if they quiz you about something that you said on the 3rd of February, 1982 in an article that you once wrote or that you said in some case, 20 years ago? How do you keep track of the things that you've said and the opinions that you've taken to make sure that you don't contradict yourself? Or is it even important that you don't contradict yourself going into depositions and into trials?
It's very important. I don't want to have a situation where I say X and the opposing counsel says, "Well, 10 years ago you said Y." And so I'd say, first of all, I keep all my reports. And before I write a new report, I'll go back and look at some of the old ones if they cover the same issue. For example, I've testified quite often on issues of disclosure and due diligence. That's a very common theme in defaulted financings. And I make sure that I'm relatively consistent in what I said even 10 years ago. And I think, my views really have not changed all that much. I have managed to stay fairly consistent. And when there is a change, in my opinion, I will always cite the context, because nothing is black and white. It's always got a nuance to it. And the opposing counsel will say, "Well, 10 years ago on Smith versus Jones, you said X." And I'll say, "Well, you're correct, sir, but Smith and Jones was a different kind of case than this case. And here why they are different." And so I reflect my opinion in the nuance of this case. And that usually is satisfactory.
Is that something that the attorney will prepare you on? Do they do a pretty good job of vetting things that you've said in the past and coaching you on how to respond to those sorts of questions?
Well, unfortunately not. And this is one of the criticisms I would have of my attorney client. I just finished a jury trial about 4 weeks ago. And very nice attorney, very knowledgeable, but did not prep me. And I prepped myself, and I spent quite a bit of time before the trial, including the night before when I was in the hotel room, reading back my opinion, reading my report, and reading some earlier reports that had been on the same topic, the same subject matter. Some clients will prep you very, very thoroughly. They'll do a mock deposition. They'll even videotape it just to prepare me for that. Other attorneys, unfortunately, do not. And I urge my attorneys, please prep me, please rehearse with me, because I want to be polished. I want to serve your cause. I've seen when I've been in trials where an ill-prepared expert witness on the other side can hurt that case badly, and a well-prepared expert witness can bolster the case badly. In the long run, the attorney wins the case. I don't.
Right.
Never claim that I win a case, but I can certainly bolster the client, the attorney's arguments with my professional opinions. But I urge my attorneys to prepare me well, force me to go through a mock deposition.
Should newer expert witnesses who haven't been in a lot of these yet, haven't been prepped a lot, should they adopt a proactive approach in making sure that their attorney is adequately preparing them? And similarly, what preparation should all attorneys be doing?
Well, one of the things I urge other experts to do, and I have given classes and CLE seminars to attorneys. I've also given, in fact, Roundtable Group used to have, you were part of
Reuters.
Thomson Reuters once. You broke away, right?
Right.
But Thomson Reuters used to have an advisory body of experts, which I was a member of. And we would meet once in a while and discuss it. And one of the things that I made when I made my presentations is when you first get engaged by an attorney, immediately sit down with the attorney and go through a long list of questions. In particular, understand the timetable very clearly. When do you want what? Understand exactly what they want me to say in opinions. You want an opinion on this? They'll say, no, don't talk about that. Talk about this over here. That's fine. I understand that. But I want to make sure that I am meeting their needs within the sphere of my own knowledge and my own base. I will not give legal opinions. And I will give opinions on areas of my expertise and not other expertise. But I sit down and have that conversation with the attorney right off the bat. First conversation we have. I want to make sure we're all on the same page in terms of expectations. I tell them I want to give them a draft to review. They almost always say, great, we love that. And I tell them that I want a very detailed prep if we're going to have deposition. In most cases, I have a deposition.
Sure.
And if it goes to jury trial, even more important to have a very detailed prep session where we play a mock cross-examination. That makes a big difference.
Let's talk about trial teams. Some trial teams consist of a variety of attorneys and paralegals and different people who are helping out with the case in different ways, maybe even separate experts in different areas. To what extent do you find yourself engaging with and even collaborating with the rest of the trial team? Or is it pretty much cordoned off into your own area where you just do your own thing?
Unfortunately, in most cases, it's pretty much cordoned off. If there are other experts involved, I'm usually not even encouraged to communicate with them. Now, typically, they are in a different area of this case. So, for example, they may be a tax expert. I'm not a tax expert. Or they might be an engineering expert, which I'm clearly not. Or they might be, I don't know what. But I'm usually not encouraged to communicate with them. And I'm not sure if the attorneys are fearful of a cross-pollination of ideas, or I'm not sure why they say that. But I almost never coordinate with other experts. I do try to coordinate with the key members of the team, and it's usually one person who drives that team. And I try to make sure I really coordinate with him or her closely. And there might be a couple of subordinates who are also involved in the case who might actually prep me. So I try to reach out to the whole team as much as I can. But I don't usually talk with other experts, which sometimes is frustrating because I want to, but that's not usually encouraged.
Let's talk about expert witnessing more generally and expertise. How do you maintain your expertise? Because some expert fields like finance, for instance, can be quite dynamic in ways. Rules change, best practices change. How do you keep up with the latest developments in your field?
I think that's a very important question. A couple of things. One is I am an active professor. I'm a professor at the University of Minnesota at their School of Business, and I'm also a professor in St. Mary's in their doctorate program. So I had the advantage of teaching these subject matters. And as I tell my students, when you're a teacher, you're also a student. You're also always learning because, as you point out, my field is very dynamic and constantly evolving and maturing. And as a teacher, I have the chance to keep up with the literature and keep reading. The other thing is when I get hired on a specific project, I will do a lot of my own research into that matter. So, for example, I mentioned I had a case in Cayman Islands or Grand Cayman about a year ago, and it had a lot to do with brokerage agreements and short selling, and that was part of the case. There were other elements, and I know skills pretty well. But I went back into Google Scholar and other areas and finance journals and brushed up on my knowledge. I read a fair amount. I had a case just a few months ago that involved BlackRock, and the subject matter there was carried interest and clawbacks. And again, I understand them conceptually, but not in detail. So I went back and did a fair amount of research. And when I write my expert reports, I always cite the sources I'm given by the attorney, the emails, the counter complaints, and all that. But then I also cite my own academic research. There's a whole bibliography section at the end of my report where I talk about, so-and-so said this, so-and-so said that, and I cite the sources in my report. So it becomes kind of a mini dissertation almost. And I want to cite authoritatively the academic sources as well as the trial sources.
Is additional research pursuant to a report a billable expense?
Oh, yes, definitely. I expense everything. I rarely get pushback on that. But I say, look, I'm rounding out my knowledge. I'm providing more depth, like the question of the carried interest and the clawback. I had some detailed citations in there, and also relating to the Investor Relations Act of 1940, which was very germane in this particular case. And I cited authoritative text, and that made my report much, much stronger. So it's absolutely billable.
In addition to keeping abreast of the latest developments in finance, do you also spend any time approaching or networking with other expert witnesses, either in general at conferences or in your field?
Well, unfortunately, there really isn't a network of expert witnesses. We don't have a trade group or an annual conference or anything. So I don't really have a chance to talk to others. I talk to people that I know, colleagues of mine, who are in related areas. And I might ask them, like I have a colleague who's been a very active broker manager. And I said, tell me a little bit about your perspective on the brokerage agreements and how they deal with short selling. And so I will pick up information from that. But I don't usually discuss the case with them. I think that's usually not appropriate.
Sure.
For confidentiality reasons, for other reasons. And in my report, I make a point of saying that I wrote the report by myself. I had no outside researchers or secretaries or clerical. I write the whole thing myself, which is true. I do. So I will do some conversation with fellow professionals at a very general level. I won't talk about the case per se.
Speaking of cases, do you have a case or two that you can talk about just generally? I know that you can't always name names because of confidentiality and other reasons, but that served as kind of touchstones in your career as an expert witness that either reinforce something about being an expert witness or change the way that you see expert witnessing in general?
Yeah, I had a wonderful case just a couple of years ago. A European investment bank underwrote a $250 million euro, not bond, sorry, 250 euro high yield junk bond transaction for a European company. The investment bank made a lot of mistakes in their disclosure materials. They tried to sell that bond in the European institutional investor market, and no one would touch it because the company was pretty questionable. And so they passed that bond issue over to their American counterparts, their American branch, which sold it to an investment management company in California. That bond issue defaulted in less than 12 months, which to me is an indication not so much a problem with the project, but with the underwriting. Something was wrong when a project defaults within less than 12 months. I was on the side of the investment management company that bought the bond. And I argued that there had been some significant flaws in the disclosure materials and the disclosure process and the management of the case by the investment bank. Now, another case was a flip around, and that's why I got confused for a second. There was another very, very large bond default in southern United States that involved, again, a project financing, which went bad in less than 12 months. In this particular case, I was defending the investment bank, which is a very large American investment bank, second-tier investment bank. And the allegation that they had failed in disclosure. And I went through their materials with a fine-tooth comb, including their cash flow pro formas, their investor outreach, their due diligence meetings. They had site visits. And I came to the opinion that the investment bank had done a very good job. They had done an acceptable level of disclosure and that they were not at fault. The fault lay with a project developer who actually ended up in criminal court and had done some criminal activity, including siphoning money away from the project. But the investment bank itself, I felt, had done a proper job, and I could defend them. So those two sides are kind of mirror images of each other. Because the one, I'm attacking an investment bank for gross failures of disclosure and management of the transaction. On the other side, I'm defending an investment bank that handled the case very, very well, very professionally, had good team approach, had good leadership, and had good disclosure. And I felt comfortable on both sides of that equation. So I'm not always a plaintiff or always a defendant expert. I will defend who I'm retained to protect.
Is there any major differences between representing plaintiffs and defendants in terms of just preparation or anything that comes to mind?
Not really. I mean, I really dug deep into disclosure materials on both cases, the European case, the American case, and I went through a detailed list of all the steps they took. For example, in the American case, they had done extensive site visits and they had done extensive conference calls with institutional investors about this project and had gone out of their way to answer questions. And I felt they did a very good job, but I went through their materials in great detail. And in the other case, the European case, again, I went in great detail through their disclosure process and their management process. And I thought they had done a very inadequate, very poor job of managing the process, very chaotic, very undisciplined, non-systematic process, kind of a fly by the seat of your pants kind of process. And they missed major issues, and they gave some extremely bad advice. They were asked questions by potential investors, and they gave clearly the wrong answer to those questions.
Does working for both sides make you more attractive as an expert witness in terms of getting engagements?
Yes, it does, because I'm sometimes asked, are you always on the plaintiff side? And I say, no, I've gone through my cases. And I'd say I'm roughly 50-50 in terms of plaintiff versus defendant. And it's not necessarily planned that way. I mean, again, I'm hired by the first guy who called me. But it just worked out that way that I will handle both plaintiffs and defendants, and I'm comfortable doing that. And I'm comfortable if my side is, I think, in the wrong, I will quietly whisper in the attorney's ear, we've got a problem here, let's try to settle this. Because I don't want to say that in my report, of course. I can't say that.
Right.
But no, I think the same metrics apply, the same analysis applies, whether it's a plaintiff or a defendant. You want to get into the details of the case. What happened, who said what, and why. And I'll say one of the things that I like to look at the most, and I always ask my attorney to do this, is give me all the email strings they have, which can be considerable. But I find that people will be very careful in their public documents. And then in emails, they will say the stupidest things imaginable, and they forget that emails are forever.
Right.
They're like cast in concrete. And an email string from 5 years ago can say awful things. And I love to quote email strings in my report. That's a treasure trove for me of information.
Right. Absolutely. You mentioned, cases going to settlement. Does that affect your role as an expert witness? The how common going to settlement has become over the years?
No, I mean, I approach a report as if it's going to go to trial. I write a very detailed report, heavily researched, both academically and with trial materials. And if it goes to trial, that's great. If it goes to settlement, that's great. I never really know what is going to happen. In fact, the two trials that I have coming up next year, I thought would settle it. And they did not settle. They failed in their settlement talks. So now they want to go to trial. So I never know. Now, the settlement process itself, I don't get involved in. They have my X report, they might have my deposition, and then the two sides go off in a corner somewhere and they duke it out and they come to a settlement. I don't get involved in that. There's been a couple of cases where I'm told what the settlement might be and what the offer is, and I'll say, well, this is a good offer, or no, it's not an adequate offer. Then they go back to the settlement table. And I find that in about half the cases, I'm not even told the settlement is. The settlement is sealed. And so my attorney will call me up and said, okay, cool, we settled last night, we're done. And I'll say, what was the settlement? I said, well, I can't tell you. It's sealed. Then my next question is our client happy? And he'll say, our client's happy. Then I said, okay, that's all that matters to me. I don't know what the numbers actually are. I don't usually learn that.
How does that affect, or does it affect your contracts? Have you changed any of your billing terms to account for cases that might go quickly to settlement or might have fewer hours or anything like that?
No, I just bill a straight flat hourly for everything that I do. And I have one fee for all the work I do. I have a different fee for travel.
Sure.
That's less demanding. But no, it's my fee structure is the same. And I've had cases. The trial that I went to a couple of weeks ago up northern Minnesota, that trial had been around for 6 years. I wrote my expert report 2.5 years ago, and I thought it had died. In fact, when the attorney called me, I was shocked. I said, "Oh my gosh, the thing is still alive." And so we went to trial, and but you never know how it's going to go. So I just do a
Right.
flat contract, number of hours billed, and I bill monthly, 50-minute increments, and that's that.
As an academic with courses to teach and as a sought after expert witness and cases going 6 years, how do you manage all of your scheduling? How do you make sure that you have time to be able to write a report, or when an attorney calls
Well,
you at the last minute, put it all together?
it's tricky, and I've got a report now that I have to write in the next couple of weeks. So I'll probably do it over the weekend.
Hmm.
The juggling can get tricky. Now, when I teach, about half my courses are online, which is great because I can be anywhere, anytime. But the
Sure.
other half of my courses are on campus. This morning, I taught a class at 8:15 in the morning at Minnesota, and I have to be there at
Right.
8:15. And then I have a class tomorrow night. It's a night class, but I have to be there on campus from 6 to 9 p.m. So I have to juggle, and it just gets a little tricky sometimes. It helps the fact that depositions now are more and more online Zoom, so I don't have to fly to Philadelphia and spend 2 days.
Sure.
I can book a deposition in the morning and get it out of the way on Zoom.
Absolutely.
Trials are trickier, and I just figure out how to do it. It's juggling, but that's okay.
Will the court work around your schedule to some extent?
Not particularly, no. The trial dates, I mean, there's so much logistics involved in setting up a trial, including juries and the two legal teams and the judge who has his or her own schedule. I have to accommodate my schedule to theirs, and I make it work.
Sure. What is important about being an expert witness? Why does expert witnessing matter?
Well, it brings a level of analysis and knowledge into a complex case. And financing cases, and of course, I'm only in the finance world,
Right.
but these cases can get really, really complicated. And the attorneys, in many cases, don't fully understand the cases. The judge, in many cases, doesn't understand the case, or at least not the details of the case. This might be a judge who does a lot of family law, or who does PI law. And now suddenly they're faced with things like carried interest and clawbacks and short selling and derivatives, and
Right.
it's a very complex field. So I think I add a layer of knowledge and depth into a case that the lawyers really can't do. And the other thing I'll bring up is that, particularly for a jury trial, I learned from the very beginning that, in fact, one of my first cases was a jury trial, which is a real learning experience for me. And when I'm first brought into a case, I'm wearing the hat of an expert.
Mhm.
I'm knowledgeable. I'm an expert. I write a detailed report. But if it goes to trial, I wear the hat of a teacher. And I'm a teacher by nature, by trade. And so I find now that my job is to sit in the witness stand and look right at the jury. And I coach my lawyer to say, the first question you're going to ask me is, Dr. Kaiser, what is this case really all about? Which is a great open-ended question, and it kind of gives me a runway. And then I try to, I don't want to say the word dumb it down, that sounds insulting, but the juries really usually by the end of a trial, they are swamped. They are absolutely flabbergasted. They don't understand all the technical terms, and they don't quite know what to make of it. And so I try to make it very simple. I'm trying to give them the Cliff Notes version of this course. And I'll say, well, Mr. Jones, this case really is about fraud. And this man defrauded that man, in my opinion. And so I make it more understandable and simple. I don't use a lot of big words like clawback and short selling. I just talk about this person did not treat this person correctly and was fraudulent and I don't want to say they were screwed because I can't in court. I'll say it's cheated. I use really basic concepts, but I'm looking right at the jury when I do that. And I find that many cases, not all, but in many cases, which to me is very gratifying, I'm seeing these little light bulbs go on in the jury's eyes. And they kind of nod and say, oh, yeah, okay, now I get it. And that's really gratifying because I'm trying to make this case understandable to them. And when I told other experts this, I'm no longer the expert, I'm now the teacher. And you have to be able to change hats.
As a teacher, and as somebody who needs to connect with juries, have you used a lot of visual aids? Do you have, charts and graphs and things to look at? And do you find that to be useful?
It depends on the case. In some cases, we're encouraged to go electronic with PowerPoints. Or in one case, I used a whiteboard to show a chain of transactions. So transaction here, the net gain was this, and the next transaction here, then an arrow down to this transaction. So I try to whiteboard it, but again, very simple, and trying to show how the client made money.
Sure.
Or else I can do a PowerPoint. Some cases involve PowerPoints, and the jury room is set up with screens and with computers. It'll vary. And most of the trials that I've been to are non-technological. I just talk.
Right.
And that's it. But some juries some courtrooms have gone very, very technological.
Absolutely. I'd like to back up to one thing you had mentioned, Thomson Reuters and the Roundtable Group before. Have you found expert witness referral services to be useful in finding work?
Yes, in fact, I just went through my list of my cases a couple of days ago, and I want to remind myself how many cases I've received through a service like Roundtable Group, or in the old days, Thomson Reuters or TASA. I've gotten referrals from TASA, and I'd say out of 51 cases, maybe 8 or so have come from referral source. And that's nice. I like that because I'm meeting attorneys that would never have met otherwise. I do a fair amount of online marketing myself, and I get a lot of referrals.
What sort of online marketing works for you?
Well, I've been doing different experiments. First of all, I tried I just create my own databases of law firms. So I'll say, I want to see all the litigation law firms in Dallas, Texas. And I usually go with the larger firms because they're more likely to have the larger cases, not the little mom and pop cases, but the larger cases. Mm-hmm. So I'll go to litigation law firms, I'll go into their website, and they usually show me who the litigation attorneys are, as opposed to the PI guys, as opposed to the environmental guys. I want the litigation guys. And if I'm lucky, they will show me who the chairman or co-chair people are of the litigation department. That's my target. Then I do not do an email. I send them a packet of mail with a cover letter addressed to them personally, a list of all my cases, which is about a 5-page list, a copy of an article that I wrote for Bench and Bar magazine, and my CV. So it's it's a little bit of package. But I figure if you email somebody, it's very easy to delete emails. I delete emails every day. I get lots of them.
Right.
I'm sure the attorneys are getting even more emails. But now, when you get an 8x12 or 9x12 envelope on your front desk that says Mr. Jones, you don't throw that away. You open it up. And now I have you.
Right.
And so I've tried that it's a little bit laborious and it costs a little money, but I get more to you. If I send you an email, it's very likely you're going to just delete it. You don't have the time to read it. So I've been trying out LinkedIn advertising. I've tried just direct mail advertising. And then I have a lot of attorneys in my database who I've done cases for before. And every once in a while, I'll send an email saying, hey, guess what? I'm still in the business. And think about me. And I just picked up a case from a lawyer that I'd done a deal for about 4 years ago. And he said, oh, Don, yeah, I forgot all about you. Here's the case. Just like that.
So stay in touch.
And then I get word of mouth. I'll get attorneys calling me up cold and saying, I've heard about you and I've got a case for you. So it varies.
Before we wrap up, do you have any last advice for expert witnesses and in particular newer expert witnesses?
Well, one thing I'll say actually I'll address this to attorneys, because I've given attorney CLE seminars, and I advise them, if you're going to hire an expert, hire the expert early on, because the more early you bring them in, the more they can add their expertise to helping you form the theory of the case. And the other thing I've noticed when I've brought into a case late is that I'll say, I want to see this, this, and this in document. And they'll say, well, discovery's over. Well, why didn't you call me 2 months ago? And it's hard to reopen discovery. So I'm not getting the data that I need, and it never occurred to the attorney. So then addressing young attorneys, I would say, really do your homework well. And then if you are unsure about how you present yourself, offer to do a Zoom call with the attorney who's questioning you as well as somebody else, and impress them with your video skills. Because what I've learned is that there could be an expert who is deeply, deeply knowledgeable, really smart, but they don't show well. They they're not comfortable, they fidget, they don't handle the presentations well. So the attorney should really interview. And I'll share with you one story. There was a case in Florida that I was proposed for. There were three candidates for that position, including me. And I called the attorney up, and he was nice, and he saw my resume and saw my list of candidate files. And he said, "Well, you appear to be pretty qualified. How do you handle trials?" I said, "I'll tell you what, sir. I will fly down to Miami on my own nickel, and I will meet with you in your conference room, and you can give me a mock deposition. I want you to see me in the flesh. I'll wear a suit and tie, and you can have me for 2, 3, 4 hours and interview me." And I did that. And it caught him off guard a little bit, but I wanted him to see me in the flesh and see how I particularly handle bad questions, disruptive questions, challenging questions.
Right.
And so we met he gave me about an hour and a half. That's all he could afford in terms of his own schedule. But I spent an hour and a half with him. And he said, "Okay, you're hired." So that was worth my flying down to Miami to get hired.
Yeah, absolutely.
But really focus on how you present yourself. Because you could be awesomely bright and knowledgeable, but if you can't handle yourself fluently and calmly and make a good presentation and handle tough questioning, because opposing counsel will try to nail you. They'll ask you disruptive questions, and how well can you handle that? And that's an important skill for a young beginning expert witness who may not have that polish, that level of presentation skill, and develop that. I actually took some speaking lessons from a professional coach several years ago, because I found that I had a habit of talking too fast and stuttering a little bit. I wanted to learn how to slow down and deliver more effectively. And so I had about 4 or 5 classes with a voice coach. It's worth it.
Sage advice. Dr. Kaiser, thank you so much for joining me here today.
Thank you, Noah. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely. And thank you, as always, to our listeners for joining me for another episode of Engaging Experts. Cheers.
Thank you for listening to our podcast, Engaging Experts. Our show notes are available on our website, roundtablegroup.com.